Okay, well, thank you very much. I'm actually going to make a couple of remarks, sort of parenthetical ones, before I get into my theme, which play on what Len just said. When I started the Media Lab at MIT, I purposely did not put it in the engineering department. It was rooted in the School of Architecture and Planning. And the reason for that was very simple. It was a belief that the future of computer science and the innovations would come from the applications, not from the engineering. And my analogy at the time was photography. And I would tell people, photography was invented by photographers, and the creative users of photography were the inventors, as compared to television. Television was invented by engineers and then used by people after the fact, if you will. And look what we got. My point was that computer science and the internet and computers in general would follow the photography model. In some sense, you've just said that. And I think it's very important to think of it that way. And then the second sort of general remark is that if you look at the world today, and this goes right into my subject, the use of the internet is in fact much more important to the rest of the world than it is to us. It's in some sense indispensable. Kids have to be connected, you have to be connected. But it is, I won't call it an accessory, but it's a piece in a relatively rich life that everybody in this room has. But now imagine that you're totally isolated, that you're poor, and that suddenly you have the internet and you have the connection. It is really fundamental. It is second only to food and air. And that without it, your life would be very different. So when I started one laptop per child, the drive was to eliminate poverty. How could you create a world that didn't have poverty? And whatever the answer is, and there are multiple answers, it would include education. And if you think of any big problem, education is almost always one of the pieces that you, in some cases, just education could often solve the problem. And when you look at the world, it's really primary education. And this isn't the favorite topic of politicians. Politicians in developing countries will want to build universities and major centers of competence for older children who will be in the workplace sooner than the 6-year-olds who really need primary education. And if you look at the global landscape, in some cases it's pretty difficult to even think about. You get a country like Afghanistan where 25% of the teachers are illiterate. The next 25% are only one grade ahead of the child they're teaching. 50% of the children don't go to school, and 75% of the girls don't go to school. So when you look at a situation like that, it is just off the charts. It's not like saying that we want to have every child in the United States have a laptop. In the United States, we spend $10,000 per child per year in primary education. So it's just a very different problem. So I will walk you through some of the sort of things we did in one laptop per child 5 years ago with this education mission being at the forefront. And a lot of these things happen through chance and through sort of serendipity. And what our goal was is to basically provide every child in the world with a connected laptop. And the word connected is absolutely key. And I can go into why we felt it was a laptop, not a cell phone, and sort of all these things which are a little bit distracting, but let me walk you through some of it. Now, this goes back to 1968, about the same time that the things we're celebrating today were happening. And I was almost thinking to myself, well, last year at MIT, when we celebrated the 40th birthday of the internet, you're supposed to laugh, but I was one of the people who had the great pleasure of using it very early on. I went to MIT in 1961, and I remember my professor saying that he had to go off for the thesis of Ivan Sutherland, and actually it was Larry Roberts. And so it was in it, and then using it very early in sort of the very early days. But what we were doing then, and particularly with a man named Seymour Papert, is trying to understand how children learned. And Seymour and I, in 1982, started doing this in developing countries. And this particular slide is from Senegal. And these kids weren't connected. But what we learned in 1982 from these projects, Pakistan, Senegal, and Colombia, was that these kids played those keyboards like pianos. The child in that photograph doesn't speak English or French, speaks Wolof. The project didn't get much traction. Steve Jobs gave us about 100 Apple IIs, and the kids in those villages certainly, had more computation probably than the central government. But it didn't get much traction, but showed us, this was just before the Media Lab was built, that the opportunity to do what we were doing at the time in the laboratory and some schools in New York City would have real meaning in those countries. And then flash forward almost 20 years. I became personally involved with some schools in Cambodia, where if you look in the background of this picture, you'll see a satellite dish. This was in a village that had no electricity, no telephone, no television, and the average income in that village at that time was $47 per year, not month, but per year. And again, fate always plays a role. At the time, my son was living in Italy, was having girlfriend problems, had started a company, which in Italy is like shooting yourself in the foot. It didn't work. And I said, if you can suffer the indignity of working for your father, why don't you go to Cambodia and connect this school? Because I built it just as a school. And I'll send you some laptops, and we'll do some of the things that Seymour and the Media Lab were doing, and we just sort of do this project. And suddenly in this village, Dimitri did such a good job. First of all, every kid in that picture, their first English word was Google. Okay. They took the laptops home because they were charged at school, and they ran them at home as long as the battery survived, and there was Wi-Fi in this village. And the parents loved it because it was the brightest light source in the house. Opened that laptop, it illuminated the room. And I looked at this picture and I said to myself, and I really mean the picture actually as well as the situation, I said, what in that picture will not happen through normal market forces? Namely, what is it? Is it the connectivity? Is it the power? Is it the laptop? I mean, how could we take this tooth fairy situation? I was the tooth fairy. This was a lucky village. I happened to put it under their pillow. And we did 5 villages, but come on, 100 kids times 5 villages, and then over a few years. How could you do this for 1 billion children? Now, out of the billion, maybe 500 million don't need it because they're living in Europe or Korea or Japan or someplace like that, but there's still 500 million that really desperately could use this. And of that 500 million, over half of them are in absolute desperate poverty and in very extreme and isolated situations. So how could we even focus on those 250 million kids? And what was it in the picture? And I looked at, said, well, telecommunications, regulatory regimes, technology, all sorts of things, that's going to reach, and the internet through the telecommunications side would empower alternate energy, so on, the grid arriving, et cetera, cell phone towers bringing electricity, at least for the tower, and it's things, but it was the laptop that bothered me. And the laptop bothered me because there was this sort of, I don't want to call it a nuclear war, but there was this, I used to joke about it. It's actually not funny anymore at all. I used to joke about every time Intel made a faster processor, Microsoft would use more of it. And then Intel would make a fast one, and this thing would go on. And then it just became that every laptop was an SUV. Okay, that just used more fuel to move the passenger than the car than the passenger. And there was this sort of increasing situation where the fat lady can't sing. You know, and I'll speak for myself, but my laptop today works worse than my laptop did 10 years ago. It's slower, it's more unreliable, it's just as expensive, and it is truly, truly a frustrating experience. It takes forever to start up, to close down. And so you say to yourself, what's going on? And what's going on is really simple. That the obesity of that laptop, which was an artificial phenomenon, which kept the price pretty high, was a spell that had to be broken. So could we, and it's particularly important because if you believe in one laptop per child, there is just the arithmetic is such that if you need 10 more laptops, it's not as elastic as telecommunications. At the time we installed that satellite dish in 2001, it was a megabit down and half a megabit up. You know, that can serve 50 kids, 60 kids, 80 kids, 100 kids, another 20 kids come. It's pretty elastic. But one laptop per child. It isn't 10 more kids, 10 more laptops, and so on. So we said, we can break the spell. And we can break the spell in two ways. One, we could just break the spell and try and do something that had much lower cost, but also, in a second way, had properties that were child-centric and properties that other laptops didn't have. I should have brought, let me grab my bag. I usually think of this and didn't think of it. Because one of the properties which is one that is really as important is that. Okay, that property. Okay, could we do that? And when Intel said to me, and Craig Barrett and I would argue on stage, and we'd be at meetings, he says, well, we make something. And I say, okay, Craig. And I throw mine. I say, now, you throw yours. I have never seen anybody, Michael Dell, Craig Barrett, none of them throw their laptops. Property like that's very important because it's kids. It has to be readable in the sun. It has to be low power. 50% of the children of this world have no power at home or at school. So you're going to what? Give them an AC adapter? Give me a break. You can't. So you got to do things that are very different, and that's what we decided we would do. And today, just to give you a few examples, because it's a clock here. I want to make sure I'm not leave time for questions. So here's what we've done. We went through the exercise of making a laptop, which is the sort of thing that you wouldn't do if you knew how hard it was to do, but ignorance was bliss, and a lot of things came out of it. And as Len said, the netbook sort of industry emerged because of it. But what we did is we focused on the parts of the world that, again, normal market forces would not. And I spent the first 5 years of, or this is 5 years old, I spent the first 2 of the 5 years doing nothing but meeting with heads of state around the world to get them to adopt it. 6 heads of state agreed to do it. Thailand, Pakistan, Libya, Nigeria, Brazil, Argentina. Now, what does agreed to do it mean? Agreed to do it means that Gaddafi is hugging Nicholas in front of a TV camera saying, I will do every child in Libya. And same thing with Shinawatra, Musharraf, Lula, I mean, every one of them. Now, that created, back in Taiwan, enough perception of need that at the peak of this project, 3,000 engineers were working on it. This wasn't a small project. As it emerged 2.5 summers ago, it was clear to me that those 6 heads of state, wonderful as they were not going to be buying millions of laptops. Partly because Shinawatra was overthrown, Obasanjo, a new president came in, Gaddafi is a bit flaky, and so on. So I said, let's adopt a different strategy. It's a little bit more like dating. You go and the people who smile at you, so it's not just picking a beautiful boy or girl, it's sort of who smiles and who's attracted. And guess what happened? Uruguay, Peru, and Rwanda emerged. And those three heads of state decided that they would do it. They weren't the biggest countries necessarily. It's the case of Uruguay, it's certainly not one of the poorest countries. But the president of Uruguay said, my legacy will be 1 laptop per child. He declared it as his legacy. They rolled out their 400,000 primary school children in Uruguay, every single child, and 10 days ago, the last child was given his laptop in Uruguay. So now if you go for Christmas to Punta del Este or something for your vacation, every child walking down the street is carrying a laptop. In Peru, which this slide is from, President Garcia made a wonderful decision. He decided, prompted admittedly, but he decided to do the remote villages, some of which still don't have the connectivity, but boy, it's going in as fast as possible. But in those remote villages, they don't even speak Spanish. They speak local native languages. And in those villages of which this picture is one, the kids are teaching their parents how to read and write. And when you find that happening, then I go back to my portrayal of Afghanistan, which I picked on before as a particular. One of the ways of looking at children and learning is to look at the children as teachers, because they will really be the agents of change. And most people when you say children and learning, they think of school and teachers and taking a body of knowledge from my head as the teacher and sort of transmitting it to the child. But this is another kind of teaching where the kids are teaching each other. Everybody's heard of the hole-in-the-wall project. Well, this is the hole-in-the-wall type sort of view of 1 laptop per child. I'm always told, oh, you can't take a laptop and drop it in the jungle and walk away from it. Well, you know what? You actually can. Now, it's not the preferred model, but you can do an awful lot of that. And the children, there's no instruction needed. When people say to me, who's going to teach the teachers to teach the children to use the laptops, I wonder what planet they come from. Okay, because it's just, there's an awful lot, and I'm not trying to dismiss teachers and school and so on, but there's a lot that the kids can do, and that's one of the reasons it's very important for them to own the laptop. If the country will not allow the kids to own the laptop and take it home, we don't go. We say thank you very much, and we go someplace else. It's one of the benefits of being a nonprofit. We're a nonprofit organization, and if somebody doesn't want to play by the rules, we're not in sales and marketing, so you don't want to do it. I don't have shareholders, so I don't have to worry about selling laptops. This is in India. India's been a bit of a nightmare for us, but in this particular school, it's been just extraordinary. This man never used computing, or computers, or connectivity. Kids were all lined up in perfect rows, sitting at attention, and they were swatted like flies, actually, if they didn't behave. And this is the way he teaches now. Kids run to school, and they just can't spend enough time with him and each other, and the parents are involved, and you see such change, just fundamental change, and it's just very different. This is a picture that is really more for me than you. This is in Uruguay. Now, the president of Uruguay had walked in the room at this moment. Okay, so it's not just that the kid, and they were sort of showing him their laptops. But the teacher in that room had been teaching for 30 years. And she heard that the laptops and connectivity was coming. And mind you, not only does every child have a laptop in Uruguay, every child has an email address and broadband connectivity at home and at school. Okay, well, this is big. A few villages still don't have it broadband, but it's coming. So it's pretty good rollout. Teacher heard this was coming, and she went to the Social Security office and said, I want early retirement. Social Security said, okay, come back in 3 weeks, because it takes us 3 weeks to process it. You've been teaching for 30 years, you're eligible, and fine. So she went back, and in the intervening period, the laptops arrived in her classroom. This is her classroom. And after 2 days, she went back to the Social Security office and said, I want late retirement. And she's still teaching, and very, very much so. Uruguay is the only country that's put us on a postage stamp. I figure that's some kind of indicator, we never expected. And being a nonprofit, we had a lot of partners. Kofi Annan helped enormously to get this going. So I really very often try to point out that the best decision we made was to be a nonprofit organization, because there's clarity of purpose. And it's very important to have clarity of purpose. You cannot be, the CEO of a laptop company and have the same clarity of purpose, and you can't have these sort of partnerships. This is the status at the moment. Numbers aren't as big as I had hoped for the laptop, but of course the netbook side of the equation makes up for it enormously. It's at a point now whether it's 1.5 million or 2 million almost doesn't matter. It's now sort of an idea, a little bit like connectivity is an idea. I'll skip the economy, and I'll sort of I'll just race through some of the images of it, but being an electronic book is very important. Brewster Kahle and I announced this past weekend 1.6 million books are now available through him and on this laptop. That's really compelling to sort of automatically get 1.6 million books, but more importantly, without touching, really, just taking much memory at all, we can put 100 books in each laptop, and when we ship 100 laptops to a village, what's perhaps even more important than the 1.6 million books is that those laptops go with 100 books, but each laptop has 100 different books. So you have 10,000 books in a village. Most of us didn't have 10,000 books in our primary school. In Peru, they've got all the books. We just got permission 2 days ago to ship laptops into Gaza. And we have 100,000 books in Arabic that will be selected from and go with those laptops into Gaza. So there's this good old-fashioned books, and sort of having that kind of data available is important, because it's sort of a Trojan horse theory here, that you don't have to get every single teacher to be interested in multimedia and interactive and change. He can just say, okay, look, it's just a book, and just put the books. And so some people will use it that way, and that's a way to get in, and at night the kids will come out and use it as a laptop. I should have just mentioned, the connectivity is very important. The so-called mesh network is, again, a way of connecting a village that doesn't have the cell phone infrastructure around. Now, Nigeria, oh, I see what's happening. These slides are going automatic. At any rate, let's see if it stops. Those slides were really just examples from Africa. We have moved our base to Rwanda. So if you're interested in seeing anything that we do with regard to education, it's all moved to Rwanda. It's not in Cambridge, Massachusetts at all. Did I lose that because it's a signal to me, or that I'm supposed to stop? But I just, now it's going forward. Let's see if I can get control back. These flicking is not AV's problem. I had left some timing data in it. But I want to try to remember the picture of the soldier. It's an important picture to me because that happens to be in Colombia. Our partner in Colombia is the Minister of Defense. And what he's interested in is going to the FARC areas, which we've been doing. I've done it with him a couple of times, where you go into the area that's been isolated for most cases 30 years, and really the 30-year-olds have never seen anything else. And so connecting them is a way to sort of end that isolation. Isolation is an interesting phenomenon because that's where a lot of problems come from. And it's, you know, poverty plays a role, but isolation also plays a big role. So our experience in the FARC regions makes us want to do even more in Afghanistan and northwest Pakistan, because the cost of ownership of these is really quite low. It's $1 a week. Now, Len saw me go ballistic in July when Microsoft showed slides about how it cost $230 a year per laptop per child, which was so shameless it was unbelievable. It doesn't cost $230 per year per child to own one of these laptops. It costs exactly $1 a week, including the purchase of the laptop. So that's not so far out of the range. And to do Afghanistan, every child in Afghanistan is $1 billion. So that's, you figure out how many hours of war that is. It's not many. And it's something that we're working hard to get the Obama administration to do. It doesn't have to be our laptop, though you probably want something you can throw around. The wind and the dust doesn't affect. And then if you really went and you said, well, let's do every child in the world, the numbers also are not totally outrageous. So I will end there. I was asked to leave time for questions, and I will leave time for questions. So thank you very much.
We have microphones in the front of the crowd. Come up and present questions. We also have the Twitter space out there generating questions as well. So if you want to ask, oh, you can't walk. Is that your problem, Lola? All right. Okay.
Can you comment, most of these villages, they can't read and write, as you said, and their language is not written, a lot of them.
Right.
How do you deal with that? What kind of apps do you have there? And the second question has to do with, a lot of these countries are side of stealing, selling, and that kind of stuff. How are you dealing with that?
Sure.
Thanks.
The language issue is that almost all countries, even if they don't have a written language for their, whatever the tribal language is, they do have a written language for the national language, even though it's unlikely to use the Latin alphabet. So we really work very hard to localize not only the keyboard, which is a physical localization, but also the software. So we are in languages that have never, ever been served. We were the first keyboard in Amharic. They had never had a keyboard before. And Amharic is a language spoken by 80 million people, 80 million people who never had a keyboard. It's the language of Ethiopia. In Mongolia, when we went in, we were the first keyboard because even cell phones are in English. Nobody in Mongolia really speaks English, but the cell phone's in English and they can learn what it means and the functions, and it's not that they learn English, because there's, again, no commercial reason to do it. And so when you look at it's now, I think we're up to about 30 or 40 languages. When you look at the languages that we're in, they are languages that in most cases you've never heard of, but Dari and Pashto and so on, which are spoken in northern or southern Afghanistan or places that you would not normally serve. And so we go out of our way to serve those areas. And then there's a lot of audio. You don't have to be literate to use the laptop. One of the favorite applications that kids find is where you type in English words and it speaks. And this is important because English, which is being taught all over the world, 99% of the people teaching English to kids in school do not speak it. And they do not know how to speak it. And if they do, it's such an accent that you can barely understand it. And very often I actually can't. The other question, the other part of your question about countries that that would be prone to take it and put it on the black market and so on. That's sort of done in two ways. One is that we go and we saturate areas. And we really, again, it's a little bit like child ownership. We won't do it unless you saturate the area. If you've got 1 million laptops, we will ask you to do 4 areas of 250,000, not try and do little pockets. So the whole area is saturated, and basically everybody has a laptop. And so it's not the big boys stealing it or the private schools stealing it or public schools or whatever. There's a saturation phenomenon. And there's also in that a phenomenon where the parents and the other kids protect each other. So the one remaining problem is what happens when the parent takes it from the child and sells it. Well, we have such good security in it that we can remotely disable a laptop if the country wants to enable the security. Peru and Uruguay have done that. So if a laptop is stolen, it's turned into a brick remotely. And the people of Uruguay know that. It's broadcast on TV, it's in sitcoms, it's in newspapers. So people know if you steal, it's not going to be very useful because it's going to be remotely disabled. And so in Uruguay, where we have real statistics now, they've shipped, the precise number is 395,000 laptops. And out of the 395,000 laptops, 380, only 380, have been lost or stolen. We can't tell the difference very often, but it's just an insignificant number. The kids, because they own them, they sleep with them. They polish them, they protect them. They really, the child ownership is so fundamental to that aspect of it. Maintenance and repair, we know the maintenance repair numbers and so on, and the kids do 95% of the maintenance and repair is done by kids 12 and 13 years old. So all those things are part of a package that has to do with child ownership and saturation. Yes?
Professor Kleinrock talked about surprises that we got on the internet. And you must have had, and you kind of mentioned them, but what were the top 3 to 5 things that came out of this that was just like, oh my gosh, you know, and people often say unintended consequences, but I mean in a good way, not in, you know, a bad way.
You know, there's so many of these. It's funny. You have these examples that I'll give you one. I mean, because to give you the 3 to 5, it is just a daily drumbeat of these things that appear on the wiki or this. But we decided we'd work with New York City and try and do all of New York City because 1.1 million kids in New York City. So we did 2 schools, one in the Bronx, one in Brooklyn, very poor schools. And so on. I went down to see one of the schools in the Bronx, and I'd never heard this term before, but there was a child in the 8th grade who was selectively mute. I hadn't heard the term, but had been to school for 8 years and not talked, not spoken a word. And when he heard that the laptops were coming, he wanted to be on the tech team that would help the 1st to 3rd graders or 1st to 4th graders do it, and sort of write a note to the headmaster. And the headmaster says to him, okay, well, if you want to do that, go home and think about it this weekend, but you got to come back on Monday talking. He came back on Monday talking, and has talked a mile a minute ever since. And when I went down there, it was like he was making up for lost time. Okay. And you see instances of that, and you find those things, and you find a parent traveling from way, way remote location in Colombia to come and see me just to thank me to allow her daughter to teach her, or to provide the means for her daughter to teach her how to read and write. You know, the parental things, these are, I won't say unexpected, but they are the kinds of anecdotal stuff that really gets you up in the morning. And you know, they're just, you know, tons of them, and they should be better documented. But, we will start doing that, actually. Yes, I don't know where the microphone is, or
over
if there are
here.
a couple of them. Great. Okay.
10 years ago, my cousin said, I gave my child a computer and their grades aren't improving at all. But my question is, in the theory of education, now that we have this new tool, I would think that there needs to be something to study how it can be used optimally. For example, education, you can't learn algebra until you know math, and you can't do math until you can read numbers. There's a sequence of things in a building. I'm wondering, I've not heard anything about that in the presentations on one laptop per child.
Yep. Well, one laptop per child is very much a disciple of what you would call constructionism. Constructionism will argue that the sequence that you and I always believed was necessary to do A before B and then B before C, and that you really couldn't do this, was in fact not as real as you and I thought. That kids in the second grade can actually do things that really are close approximations, and in some case real physics, even though they don't have algebra. And even though they don't have some of the things that we thought were all necessary, were prerequisites. So one laptop per child stays out of what is called curriculum. We don't do curricula. We don't go in and try and automate a curriculum of a nation, partly because it's very culturally centric and partly because it draws upon what we call instructionism versus constructionism, and it's fine, and the countries do it. In Uruguay, we have 180 full-time people. In Peru, we have even more. But they don't work for us. They work for the one laptop per child Peru, one laptop per child Uruguay. And in the case of Peru, those people are in the Ministry of Education. There is a vice minister for one laptop per child. There's a whole group that looks at curriculum and content and develops and shares with other Spanish-speaking countries. And so that's happening. But the quick line is Gutenberg didn't write the books. And so we're really on the Gutenberg side of it. We want to get the kids connected. We want to give them the tools to do things with the laptop, the accessories, and so on. But then the country does, I think, what you're asking me about. And there's been an astonishing growth in the software, especially in Spanish-speaking countries, because in Latin America, with the exception of Brazil, it's the common language. And it really is growing now in ways that it never did before. Education departments of nations tend to be the least global. You'll have a minister of education who looks only internally, and the neighboring country also speaks Spanish but writes their own textbooks. I mean, it's crazy. But so there's that kind of sharing happening.
I understand, and I would think that the educational community could help. I had a hard time getting my son stop playing games and watching X-rated movies on his computer. I mean, when you have it in hand, you may not necessarily use it constructively.
Well, we should, it's a separate topic because, you know, maybe your son got the computer too late. Maybe you should have gotten it earlier. And, but it's, yes, sir, did you have?
I had a question about sustainability. You talked about how it would cost, it only costs $1 per week per child, I believe was the figure you put up. I wonder, how many weeks does that cover? At what point does, I mean, obviously these laptops that you have aren't going to last forever. They break down at some point.
5 years is the answer.
Okay, so then my next question is, if then that gets renewed every 5 years, who pays for that?
It's the same dollar. In other words, it will cost $1 a week in perpetuity. That dollar takes into account that after the 5th year, you got to replace it. So it's still the dollar. It's not as if suddenly it's not like a balloon, you know.
But don't you have to buy new hardware to replace it?
You do, but I'm assuming I'm spreading the costs. The dollar per week, the issue is how do you spread it? Do you get the World Bank to front it, and then it's the dollar a week? There is a front-loaded cost, there's no question, in reality, because somebody has to manufacture something and ship it and so on and so forth. And that's why in the first year of one laptop per child, or I forget numbers, like $200 million of laptops, but that's a front-loaded cost. And then it turned out that it was $17 per year to maintain it, which is a lot less than $1 a week. but then you amortize the front-loaded cost, and that's where the dollar comes from.
Thank you.
What has been your experience as you deal, particularly with the countries where you have laptops deployed, with the wide range of religions, cultures, ethnic groups? And the thing that occurred to me is when you put 100 books or 10,000 books in an area, governments usually have very firm ideas on what's allowable and what's not. And so how do you deal with that? You know, there's a compromise. Is it, do you walk out if it's too much? How do you handle that?
Well, we walk out on rare occasion, but the ability to walk out really helps. And when countries know you can and might walk out, it also makes them a little bit less presumptive and a little bit less assuming. But don't have to do it very often, because you can always download other stuff. So when people ask, because we make images for the country, so when the laptop is manufactured for Peru, it has a Peru image, which includes, you know, the textbooks for Peru and so on and so forth. Now, in the Islamic countries particularly, where you don't put certain things, and so you can always put it later, the kids know they can download it, etc., but you go in with what the country wants. And if China says they don't want a Wikipedia entry for democracy, you know, I'm not going to argue with that. I have other battles to fight. So a crippled laptop is better than no laptop at all, but it's crippled in a way that doesn't, you know, from my point of view, it's not so crippled at all. It's still a general purpose machine. You can suck stuff down and you can bootleg things and kids can share stuff. So I just want to get it in there. And so sometimes it'll look like I'm compromising more. I was always wondering what would happen when Gaddafi wanted his face as the screensaver. And
I think we're going to have to draw this to a
okay.
conclusion.
Well, I'm here for most of the day.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Terrific, yeah.